Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us again on the TSWW Games and TKC Games channel. We're joined with Geoff this evening, and Geoff and I are going to have a little chat with you about Ukraine and the current situation. As you know, I've got some pretty strong views in this. Geoff, how do you think things are going?
Right. Well, they're not really going at all, are they? You have the Russians attacking on pretty much every single axis. You have the Ukrainians, they don't seem to be bothering to advance much at the moment. The only real movement is around Bakhmut, though the Ukrainians have been repelled from Crimea. And it looks like the Russians are currently expending huge amounts of manpower on that particular area. So really, as far as I can tell, it probably, I think, unless the Ukrainians break dramatically at Bakhmut, and they've got one road out, I think, one major artillery route out left that the Russians haven't seized, should be on artillery range now. If the Ukrainians retreat from Bakhmut and do a new defensive line, really we need to wait until the Ukrainians do a new offensive to see if anything dynamic is going to happen. Though whether that offensive succeeds is another question entirely.
Yeah.
What do you think, John?
I think, would it be fair to say we've essentially got Verdun or the Somme or Passchendaele on the Dnipro line now, to some extent? And certainly I've been seeing some film. I haven't followed it quite as much as I think you have, but what I've been seeing, it looks awful clean. Guys in nice, neat uniforms and fairly recently dug trench lines. That's not what I would recall from looking at pictures of guys who've been in combat in either the two world wars or Vietnam or Korea, or the Arab-Israeli wars, or even the Falklands crisis, which, by the way, we're going to talk about in our next video. So you might want to tune in for that if you want to find out a wee bit about where we're going with Last Mile Venus, the BTW game for that. Is the combat as intense as some commentators seem to be saying?
I'm beginning to wonder if there is some censorship, because I have seen certain videos where you have a lone tank driving along, gets blown up, but the environment around it is devastated.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm beginning to wonder if you've got certain areas that are pristine, that they're sort of doing a lot of the filming on, and then you've got certain other areas where it's just been so concentrated into small pockets of land. I wouldn't be surprised if both perspectives are correct. You've got areas at the front where nothing is happening, and then areas at the front where huge amounts of ordnance are just being packed into one small area. In fact, this morning I saw one particular explosion, a massive mushroom cloud. It zoomed out, and you can see you can't see the trees, it's so far away, but it's just this incredible explosion. But then it was only one explosion. I found that very interesting. Didn't see anything moving. It's penny packets of stuff moving around. It's strange.
It's quite weird, this. I was speaking to, I've mentioned before, I've got a friend whose family are kind of on both sides of that border, and I was speaking to her recently. I saw her last weekend, in fact, when you guys were up for the meeting, and we went a gig. But her son's in Belgorod, and apparently Belgorod's getting very heavily shelled on a fairly regular basis. Now, we never hear about any other, or very rarely do we hear about anything going the opposite direction out of Ukraine. And she's understandably very concerned. The Russian government, apparently as of tonight, are concerned enough that they're laying on buses to take those who wish to leave Belgorod out. So they're willing to evacuate their populace from Belgorod. Now, Belgorod is not that far from Kharkov. And I'm sorry, guys, it's not Kharkiv, it's Kharkov. We're English, we're Scottish, we are not Ukrainian, right? More to the point, we don't understand these languages particularly well here, and I've got to be honest, I get moaned at for some of the spellings in my games, and I'm not prepared to change it at this time. Really, I'm not. But there must be more going on. You know, the Americans have provided MLRS. Their systems are at least 100 km range. You know, that's kind of like firing from, I don't know, Aberystwyth at some sheep. in Wales. But certainly from here, pretty much to Edinburgh, in Blairgowrie, all the way almost to Edinburgh. Right, that's a massive penetration potential for the weapon systems. And one would have thought if you're really serious about attriting the Russian capability to operate, you'd be firing that into the rear area to try and hit rail nodes and so on and so forth. And essentially interdict what you can't interdict because you don't have an air force. Use missiles instead. But that brings us on to another really interesting question. Should the West be providing Ukraine with high-tech, advanced, very modern weapon systems which are battlefield-centric? I've got a concern about this. Should Britain be giving them Challenger 2? Should the Americans give them a late model Abrams or the Germans Leopard 2s? I'm not convinced we should, because if you lose a couple of them, the Russians can actually look at what we're doing right, and they're clearly doing wrong with their tanks, and might learn some stuff. Because a whole different thing from getting a schematic to actually getting your hands on a vehicle that you can repair and get moving and actually play with it. And in case you aren't aware of it, the T-34 is a case in point. The Germans almost completely reverse engineered it. Now, they elected to build the Panther instead in World War II, but one of the plans they had was to put a petrol engine in a T-34 and just use it. It would actually have been cheaper and quicker than the Panther. Equally, RAF Bomber Command lost centimetric radar, and the second time we used it over Germany. Fortunately, the Germans weren't quite sure that this stuff worked. They thought it might be something else and left it on a shelf for a wee while before their experts really dug into it. And because German electronics were not particularly good in World War II, they didn't get centimetric radar till right at the end through the cavity magnetron, which is how the British and the Americans were doing it by that point. And it gave us a huge edge in certain types of combat. Should, Geoff, do you think we should be giving them that kind of stuff that can be captured on a battlefield?
I'm going to try and answer the question slightly obliquely, because as you were saying in a previous conversation we had, the Americans were stripping out some of their older but relatively advanced Abrams. I know that Jordan has a lot of Challenger 1s, though whether they're any state to be used is another question entirely. I would probably go for stuff which is more advanced than what the Russians are generally using, but less advanced than what we have. So if the Russians obtain that, oh dear, how sad. They're scrambling to upgrade their stuff to that standard, whilst we're already, 3 or 4 generations ahead of them anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm not against the Ukrainians getting some equipment, because if we want Putin to be removed, he's got to suffer some losses. But at the same time, we've got to find a way to we've got to find some equipment that isn't going to end up in China hands, because I don't care about Russia. It's China that really worries me. I don't want them knowing how a Challenger 2 works. But there's a third side of this problem, and it's a political element. Would Germany have given any tanks at all if we hadn't promised the Challengers? So it could be a damned if we do, damned if we don't situation.
Possibly not. But would there not maybe be an argument that the Germans or maybe the Turks could have been convinced to get rid of some old M60s from the Turkish army? Have the Americans give them some Abrams?
Yes, there is that.
Is that not kind of the deal that the Germans did with the tanks in the Polish army?
Mm-hmm.
Here, Poland, have some of these. Give them all your old T-72s.
Yeah, that is very true. It's politics is brute force. How much brute force can you apply to get someone else to do something you want them to do? So how could we have convinced the Germans to do that? Could we have given some? I don't know. Do we have any really old Challenger 2s in service?
Not that I'm aware of. My understanding is that Challenger 1 that we had, they took the engines out and collapsed the back compartment that the engine fits in because it had to have the engine frame.
Yeah.
Idiots. The Americans do have old M1 Abrams, A1s and A2s, as far as I'm aware, quite a lot of them in storage. And they can be upgraded to A4 or A5 or whatever is the latest ones are, I can't remember. But essentially, they're the old ones with gas turbine engines. They guzzle fuel. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, Ukraine has, when push comes to shove, a cash flow problem. Right? Are they actually buying these tanks? Are they being gifted? Are we going to give them the spare parts to keep them in the field? Right? I've heard nightmare stories about Abrams and Challenger and Leopard 2 that you need to be constantly maintaining it with fairly high-tech maintenance equipment, albeit they're significantly better than German World War II tanks, which if you had a minor problem, you generally had to send it back to the factory to get it remanufactured. But there's clearly a concern, I think, that our politicians haven't maybe thought through. And the Ukrainian demands or requests or pleas, whichever way you want to look at it, for things like the F-16. Now, the F-16's fourth gen. It's heavily bypassed now by more modern aircraft. You get fifth generation aircraft across NATO, where it's the Super Hornet or the very latest blocks of the F-16 itself, Eurofighter Typhoon, etc. Someone suggested that they should buy Swedish. You know, get the Gripen, whatever the latest one is. Begins with a G anyway, right? I think it's a clever idea. Raphael, in its earlier marks, the French have quite a few of them, as I understand it, have been phased out and are presumably not been scrapped. I'm fairly sure the Americans have got early block F-16s and the aircraft graveyard in the middle of the desert, right? They are preserved there. That might not be such a bad thing, but do you want to try again for the same reasons, giving very high-tech kit, which is extremely labour-intensive, very spares-intensive, to a force which so far has shown itself entirely incapable of operating its own aircraft at any great intensity? And yes, I appreciate it's a high-threat environment, but NATO was designed to operate in that environment, as was the Soviet bloc. And if you look at the Arab-Israeli wars, both sides operated in a high-threat environment with considerable effect. Loss rates were quite high, but we're not hearing that much about the Ukrainian Air Force. We never have done. We had the mysterious ghost of Kiev, who seems to have disappeared, and that's about it. You know, why are we even thinking about giving them stuff that it would appear they can't really use?
Hope, I suppose. We want. The problem is what exactly do we want to do to Russia? Because at the end of the day, if we're okay with Russia grinding its way across Ukraine, then don't give anything. But is that good enough for Western policymakers? What exactly is the goal?
I'm not getting the goal here, because if we're unwilling to appease Putin, we would have drawn a line in 2014, surely.
Well, the problem is, I think Western policymakers are incredibly gradual in how they form opinions, and then they're very, very slow in applying those opinions to actual policy, and then the policy takes a very long time to take effect. We did have Operation Orbital. We did train certain Ukrainian servicemen. I would not be surprised, given how, I mean, the Ukrainian military in 2014 was rubbish. It may be bad now, but there were virtually no armored vehicles working at all. The corruption was extreme. I wouldn't be surprised if we did a lot of softly, look, get your act together. We will only support you if you make your military vaguely competent. I wouldn't be surprised if we'd done a lot of that. So at the end of the day, I think we're grasping towards this. We want Putin to decisively be beaten, and any change in that, based on battlefield results, is going to be similarly slow.
Yeah. The other question I've got, but we'll come back to this one because we're going to run out of time with this wee video fairly shortly, but what use is 90 modern tanks given the size of Ukraine?
Depends on where the Spearhead is utilised. It might actually be a good idea for them to have only a few number of modern tanks so they don't squander them. And then have the rubbish stuff to follow up and do the attriting and be attrited in return. It might not be the worst idea.
Yeah, I'm looking at it, and it's, you know, it's the. I was sitting listening to the BBC News a few weeks ago, and 90 missile strikes. Guys, you can fit the whole of Western Europe pretty much into Ukraine.
Yeah.
90 missile strikes is roughly the same chance of you dying as you walking across the road.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you die, it's terrible. I get that. But we're not talking about it's raining missiles rather than men here, right? To borrow a song from a line from a song. So I can't. I'm very much of the view that the message is pumping in just enough to be a pain. It's kind of like what we did with the Mujahideen, or at least what the Americans did with the Mujahideen. And let's face it, guys, before we come to the end of it, that went really well, didn't it? You know. And in that little thought, to me, we either get on the bandwagon properly, but that means going round the whole of the third world to pick up every bit of Soviet era kit and give it to the Ukrainians, or give them a decisive Western equipped advantage, which will take 2 to 3 years to train properly to utilize it effectively. Is the world prepared? I personally don't think it is, to continue taking the hits in supply chain costs that we are right now. And the next time we talk about it, I think we'll talk about environmental, economic rather, pain. Because if you think about it, Facebook's a wonderful judge of the middle class, middle-aged American. And they're screaming about gas prices. They're screaming about prices going up. There's midterm elections coming, or end of term elections coming. Biden needs to get re-elected, or whoever replaces him. And old Donald's going to be there. So I'll leave you all with that little thought. Geoff, thanks again. Guys, if you've enjoyed it, like it. If you don't like it, dislike it, feel free to comment down below. You can find out a bit more about TKC Games and the products that we produce and our software project and so on and so forth, and various links which are in the description down below. Have a wonderful balance of your week, and we'll catch you soon. Have a really good evening. Take care. Bye-bye.